Lost. Their capital city has fallen. Their clothes are literal rags. Their shoes have disintegrated, leaving a trail of bloody footprints in the frozen mud of Pennsylvania. The British are warm in Philadelphia, drinking wine and mocking the rebel cause. In the center of this frozen hell stands one man. He is surrounded by starving men, a divided Congress, and generals plotting to replace him. Every logical reason says he should surrender, but George Washington is not a logical man. He is a man of destiny. This is not just a story of war, it is a story of how a ghost of an army became a superpower. The Road to the Valley of Death. The date is December 19th, 1777. The wind howls like a wounded beast through the skeletal trees of Valley Forge. 12,000 men stumble into the clearing. They aren't marching, they are limping. Some are wrapped in thin blankets, others have nothing but their pride to shield them from the biting frost. George Washington sits atop his horse, his face a mask of grim determination. He watches his men, his barefoot Liberty boys, as they begin to dig into the frozen earth. The location was a strategic choice, high ground, close enough to keep an eye on the British in Philadelphia, but far enough to avoid a surprise slaughter. But as the first night falls, the reality sets in. There are no cabins, there are no beds, there is no food. Washington knows that if he cannot keep this army alive through the next 4 months, the United States of America will be nothing more than a failed experiment, and his neck will end up in a British noose. He retreats to his tent, the flickering candlelight revealing a man carrying the weight of a continent on his shoulders. The struggle hasn't even begun, and already the men are starting to die. By January 1778, the Grand Continental Army had become a collection of walking ghosts. The festive spirit of the new year was nowhere to be found. Instead, a thick, suffocating gray mist hung over the camp, smelling of wood smoke, rot, and the iron scent of frozen blood. The supply lines had completely collapsed. The Continental Congress, safe and warm in York, Pennsylvania, was paralyzed by bureaucracy and infighting. They sent letters to Washington asking why he wasn't attacking the British. Washington's private response was a roar of controlled fury. It is a much easier thing to draw up reports in a comfortable room than occupy a cold, bleak hill and sleep under frost and snow without clothes or blankets. The belly of the beast. Food was the first thing to go. For days at a time, the men lived on fire cake, a tasteless, gummy paste made of flour and water baked on a hot stone. It didn't provide strength, it only delayed the sensation of starving to death. Some soldiers became so desperate they boiled their own leather breeches and shoes, hoping to extract some sliver of protein from the animal hide. In the huts, men huddled together for warmth, often sharing a single thin blanket between 4 people. When one man died, and they were dying by the dozens every day from typhus and pneumonia, his comrades would wait for his body to cool just so they could strip the clothes off him. It wasn't cruelty, it was the math of survival. Then came the whispers. In the shadows of the smoky huts, the word mutiny began to circulate like a virus. Small groups of soldiers started to gather, their eyes hollow and angry. They hadn't been paid in months. Their families at home were starving. Why were they dying for a Congress that didn't care? One evening, a chant rose up from the ranks, echoing through the frozen valley. No meat, no soldier. No meat, no soldier. It was a rhythmic, haunting sound that signaled the end of discipline. Washington heard the chanting from his headquarters at the Isaac Potts house. His aides urged him to use force to quiet the men, to hang the ringleaders as an example. But Washington knew better. He knew he wasn't leading slaves, he was leading citizens. He walked out into the cold, refusing his heavy overcoat to show his men he felt the chill too. He didn't approach them with a sword, he approached them with his presence.
He looked into their eyes, red-rimmed from smoke and exhaustion, and he listened. He didn't promise them a feast he couldn't provide, but he promised them that he would stay with them until the very end. He would eat what they ate. He would suffer what they suffered. But behind his calm eyes, Washington was terrified. He knew that the British General Howe was only 20 miles away in Philadelphia. If Howe realized how broken the Americans really were, he could march out and end the American Revolution in a single afternoon. Washington sat at his desk late into the night, writing a desperate letter to a friend. If a change does not take place, this army must dissolve. He was staring into the abyss, and the abyss was staring back. The winter had reached its cruelest peak in February. Over 2,500 men were dead, buried in shallow, unmarked graves because the ground was too frozen to dig deep. The Continental Army was no longer an army. It was a collection of dying individuals. But just as the flame was about to flicker out, a stranger arrived at the gates of Valley Forge, a man who would change the course of human history. The arrival of the Baron. On February 23, 1778, a flamboyant, barrel-chested man rode into camp on a massive war horse. He wore a blue uniform dripping with gold lace and a chest full of medals. This was Friedrich William Steuben, a former member of the elite Prussian general staff. He spoke no English. He was followed by a tiny Italian greyhound, and he carried a reputation for being the most ruthless drill master in Europe. Washington looked at this man, this Baron, and saw his last best hope. He didn't need more speeches. He needed a professional killing machine. The language of war. Steuben was horrified by what he saw. In Europe, armies were clockwork instruments. At Valley Forge, he found men who didn't know how to march, who didn't know how to use a bayonet. They used them to toast meat over fires, and who relieved themselves wherever they pleased, spreading disease. Steuben didn't waste a second. He hand-picked a model company of 100 men and began training them personally. The camp became a theater of the absurd and the intense. Because he couldn't speak English, Steuben would scream commands in German and French. When the soldiers got confused, he would turn to his translator and yell, "Over here! Tell these rascals to do what I say. Curse them in English for me." The soldiers laughed at first, but then they saw the results. He taught them how to load their muskets in a rhythmic, terrifyingly fast sequence. He taught them that a bayonet wasn't a cooking tool. It was a weapon that won battles when the powder was wet. The transformation. Washington watched from the sidelines as the transformation took hold. The camp began to smell different. Steuben had ordered the latrines moved and the huts organized. Discipline began to replace despair. The men were still hungry, yes, but they now had a purpose. They were no longer farmers with guns. They were becoming soldiers. Under the freezing rain and the biting winds, the model company began to march in perfect unison. The sound of their boots hitting the mud, thump, 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 sounded like the heartbeat of a new nation. The conspiracy in the shadows. But while Steuben was building the army, Washington's enemies were trying to tear him down. A group of high-ranking officers and politicians, known as the Conway Cabal, was moving in the shadows. They sent anonymous letters to Congress claiming Washington was incompetent and General Horace Gates should take command. Washington was fighting two wars at once, one against the elements and one against the backstabbing politics of his own government. He knew that if he faltered for even a moment, the cabal would strike, Steuben's training would be wasted, and the American Revolution would collapse from the inside out. One night, sitting in his cold office, Washington was presented with evidence of the betrayal. His advisors expected him to explode in rage. Instead, he simply sent a copy of the treasonous letter back to the conspirators with a short, cold note. He let them know he knew. It was a move of pure psychological warfare. He wouldn't let them distract him from the only thing that mattered, the survival of his men.
The king. As the calendar turned to April 1778, the bite of winter began to soften, but it left behind a landscape of scars. The great hunger was fading, but the psychological toll remained. The men who crawled out of their log huts were not the same men who had entered them in December. They were leaner, harder, and possessed a strange, quiet ferocity. They had survived the worst that God and nature could throw at them. Now they were waiting for the British. The French connection. In early May, a rider galloped into camp, his horse lathered in sweat. He carried news that hit the camp like a lightning bolt. France had officially entered the war. The alliance was a personal victory for Washington and the tireless diplomacy of Benjamin Franklin in Paris. But for the men in the mud, it meant something more practical. Ships, gunpowder, and most importantly, the recognition that they weren't just rebels, they were a sovereign nation. Washington ordered a feu de joie, a fire of joy, a massive military celebration. Imagine the scene. Thousands of men, many still lacking proper coats, lined up in two long ranks. On a signal, a running fire of musketry rippled down the line, followed by 13 booming cannon blasts. It was a display of von Steuben's training. The rabble now moved with the precision of a Swiss watch. Washington, usually stoic and reserved, actually smiled. He knew the British in Philadelphia would hear the echoes of those cannons and realize the game had changed. The British retreat. The British High Command in Philadelphia, now led by General Henry Clinton, realized they were in a trap. With the French Navy heading for the American coast, Philadelphia was no longer a safe haven. It was a cage. Clinton made the decision to abandon the city and march his 15,000 troops and a massive baggage train across the blistering heat of New Jersey to the safety of New York City. Washington faced a choice. His generals, including the arrogant and suspicious Charles Lee, argued that they should let the British go. They are the finest army in the world, Lee argued. To attack them is madness. But Washington saw something Lee didn't. He saw the fire in his men's eyes. He saw the way they handled their bayonets. He knew that if the Continental Army didn't fight now, the spirit of Valley Forge would be wasted. He overruled his generals. "We march," he commanded. The Battle of Monmouth, the ultimate test. On June 28, 1778, the two armies collided under a sun so brutal it killed more men than the bullets did. The temperature soared past 100 degrees Fahrenheit, 38 degrees Celsius. Men dropped dead from heat stroke while standing in formation. General Lee, leading the American advance guard, lost his nerve. He saw the wall of British redcoats and ordered a confused, chaotic retreat. The American lines began to crumble. It looked like the disaster of 1776 all over again. Then, through the dust and the heat haze, appeared a massive white horse. Washington galloped into the center of the retreating mob. He was a titan of fury. Witnesses said the air turned blue with the strength of his swearing as he confronted Lee. He didn't just stop the retreat, he turned it around. In the middle of a literal inferno, Washington stood his ground, his tall frame making him an impossible target for British marksmen. The birth of a superpower. The British launched charge after charge. In the past, the Americans would have broken, but this time they stayed. When the British charged with bayonets, the very weapon that had terrified the Americans for years, the Continental soldiers didn't run. They leveled their own steel and met the British head-on. For the first time in the war, the two armies fought to a bloody standstill in a traditional European-style field battle. When the sun finally set, the British used the cover of darkness to slip away toward New York. They had been outfought by the ghosts they had mocked just months before. The legacy of the winter. The morning after the battle, Washington slept under a tree among his men.
He didn't return to a mansion or a tent. He stayed on the ground, his cape spread over the dirt. Valley Forge was a graveyard, but it was also a womb. The men who survived that winter had been forged into something unbreakable. They were no longer Virginians or Pennsylvanians or New Englanders. They were Americans. Washington had won, not by a brilliant tactical maneuver, but by the sheer, stubborn refusal to quit. He had looked at the cold, the hunger, the betrayal, and the might of the British Empire, and he had simply said no. The war would drag on for years, but the soul of the United States was born in the snow of Valley Forge. The world would never be the same again. The victory at Monmouth was the physical proof that the army had survived, but for George Washington, the war within his own ranks was far from over. As the dust settled, the winter of Valley Forge didn't just end, it transformed into a different kind of struggle, a fight for the very soul of the new nation. The trial of the traitor general. Charles Lee, the man who had nearly destroyed the army at Monmouth with his cowardice, didn't go quietly. He demanded a court-martial to clear his name, insulting Washington's leadership in public letters. This was the ultimate test of Washington's political survival. If Lee won, Washington's authority would be shattered. The trial lasted for weeks in the heat of the summer. Washington remained silent, refusing to sink to Lee's level of petty insults. He let the facts speak. When the verdict came back, Lee was found guilty and suspended from command. The message was sent to every officer in the army. There is only one commander-in-chief. The conspiracy that had started in the frozen huts of Valley Forge was finally dead. The ghosts that stayed behind. Washington eventually led his army back toward New York, circling the British like a wolf. As they passed near the hills of Pennsylvania, many soldiers looked back toward the direction of Valley Forge. They didn't see a military camp, they saw a cemetery. Historians estimate that nearly 2,000 to 2,500 men died in those 6 months without ever firing a single shot at a redcoat. They died of itchy skin, scabies that turned into open sores, of putrid fever, and of feet that turned black from frostbite until the toes simply fell off. Washington never forgot them. For the rest of his life, he was haunted by the naked and starving soldiers. This is why he refused to be paid for his service. He knew that his salary had already been paid in the lives of the boys who slept in the mud of Valley Forge. The irony of victory. There is a famous story, perhaps a legend, but one that captures the truth of the man, of a local Tory named Isaac Putz. Putz was a man who didn't believe in the revolution. One winter day, he was walking through the woods of Valley Forge when he heard a sound. He crept through the bushes and saw a large bay horse tied to a tree. Nearby, in the snow, was George Washington. He was on his knees. His hat was off, and his head was bowed. He was praying, not for victory, not for glory, but for the lives of his men. Putz, seeing this, went home and told his wife, "The Americans will win. A cause led by such a man cannot fail." The legacy of the barefoot soldier. The American Revolution would last 5 more grueling years after Valley Forge. There would be more defeats, more hunger, and more betrayals. But the Continental was now a breed of soldier the world had never seen. They weren't fighting for a king that sat on a golden throne across the ocean. They were fighting for the man on the white horse who had stayed in the snow with them. When the British finally surrendered at Yorktown in 1781, the world was shocked. How did a group of farmers beat the greatest empire on earth? The answer wasn't found in the gunpowder or the French ships. It was found in the winter of 1777. Valley Forge proved that the American spirit isn't defined by how hard we hit, but by how much we can endure and still stand up. George Washington didn't just win a war, he outlasted a winter that should have killed a nation. Epilogue. the general's final act. Years later, when Washington resigned his commission and gave up his power, something no conquering general in history had ever done, King George III of England was stunned. He said, if he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world. Washington did it. He went home to Mount Vernon, a private citizen. But every winter, when the frost bit the glass of his windows, he surely remembered the smell of wood smoke, the sound of von Steuben's shouting, and the bloody footprints in the snow that led the way to a free America.
In fact, for Washington, the years following that frozen winter were a grueling test of patience that would have broken any other man. While the world watched the grand maneuvers of the French Navy and the British Parliament, Washington was playing a high-stakes game of psychological chess. The long silence. For 3 years after the winter at Valley Forge, Washington's main army settled into a tense watch-and-wait strategy around New York. To the public, it looked like a stalemate. To the soldiers, it felt like Valley Forge all over again. Periods of hunger, lack of pay, and shivering in mountain camps. But there was a difference now. The men were professionals. The Baron von Steuben was still there, his blue coat fading, but his discipline ironclad. The army had become a shadow that the British couldn't shake. Every time the British General Clinton thought about leaving New York to crush the rebellion in the South, he looked at the hills where Washington sat, and he stayed put. Washington had turned his army into a fleet in being, a constant threat that forced the British to stay defensive. The Southern Fire. While Washington held the North, the war turned brutal in the South. Names like Banastre the Butchered Tarleton and Lord Cornwallis began burning through the Carolinas. Washington made a heartbreaking decision. He stayed in the North. He knew that if he moved his main army, the British would seize the Hudson River and cut the colonies in half. He sent his best student, Nathaniel Greene, to the South. Greene had been with Washington at Valley Forge. He had seen how Washington traded space for time, how he lost battles but won the war of attrition. Greene used those same Valley Forge tactics, running, harrying, and exhausting the British until Cornwallis, tired and depleted, retreated to a small tobacco port called Yorktown. The trap is sprung. August 1781. Washington received the word he had been waiting for since the snows of 1777. The French Admiral de Grasse was bringing a massive fleet to the Chesapeake Bay. This was the moment. In a feat of military brilliance that still baffles historians, Washington faked an attack on New York to keep the British pinned down, then marched his army 400 miles south in the blistering summer heat. Among those marching were the veterans of Valley Forge. They were older now, scarred and gray-haired, but they marched with the precision of the Prussian guards. When they arrived at Yorktown, they saw the British trapped against the sea. The French fleet blocked the water. Washington blocked the land. The final siege. The siege of Yorktown was not a battle of luck. It was a battle of engineering and sheer will. Night after night, the American and French troops dug parallels, trenches that crept closer and closer to the British lines. On the night of October 14th, Washington ordered an assault on Redoubt No. 10. He chose a young, ambitious aide-de-camp to lead it, Alexander Hamilton. The orders were strict. To ensure total surprise, the men were to unload their muskets. They would attack using only the bayonet, the weapon von Steuben had taught them to master in the freezing mud of Valley Forge. The Americans moved like ghosts in the dark. They didn't fire a shot. They climbed the embankments, hacked through the wooden defenses, and took the fort in 10 minutes of brutal, silent, hand-to-hand combat. The world turned upside down. 5 days later, on October 19, 1781, the British Army marched out of Yorktown to surrender.
Their drums played a tune called "The World Turned Upside Down." Lord Cornwallis was so humiliated that he claimed to be sick and sent his second-in-command to deliver his sword. When the British officer tried to hand the sword to the French general Rochambeau, the Frenchman pointed across the field to Washington. Washington, standing tall on his horse, didn't accept the sword himself. He directed the officer to his own second-in-command. It was a final, cold lesson in dignity. As the 8,000 British soldiers stacked their muskets, the veterans of Valley Forge stood in a long line, watching. They were no longer the barefoot Liberty boys who had boiled their shoes for soup. They were the victors over the greatest empire on the planet. The silent victory. The war was effectively over, but Washington's greatest challenge was still to come. His men, unpaid and angry at Congress, were on the verge of a military coup. They wanted to march on the government and make Washington king. Washington walked into a meeting of his officers. He took out a letter from a congressman, but he couldn't read it. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a pair of spectacles, something his men had never seen him wear. He said quietly, "Gentlemen, you will permit me to put on my spectacles, for I have not only grown gray, but almost blind in the service of my country." The hardened men, the men who had survived Valley Forge and Yorktown, began to weep. In that one moment, the threat of a military dictatorship died. Washington saved the Republic, not from the British, but from itself. The guns had fallen silent, but the war for the memory of Valley Forge was just beginning. In 1783, after the formal Treaty of Paris was signed, George Washington did the one thing no one expected. He went home. He didn't ask for a crown, a title, or a lifelong pension. He simply wanted to be a farmer again. The last goodbye. At Flounce's Tavern in New York City, Washington gathered his remaining officers for a final farewell. These were the men who had shared the starving time with him. He was too choked with emotion to speak a long oration. He simply said, "With a heart full of love and gratitude, I now take leave of you." He shook the hand of every man in the room. Some of these battle-hardened giants sobbed openly as they embraced the man who had been their father, their general, and their shield against the winter. The fate of the survivors. The men who survived the winter of 1777 went back to their lives, but they carried Valley Forge in their bones. Many returned to find their farms in ruins and their pockets empty. Because the Continental Congress was broke, many soldiers were paid in IOUs that were worth almost nothing. Yet decades later, when these men were old and gray, they would gather at town squares on the 4th of July. They didn't talk about the glory of Yorktown. They talked about the cold. They talked about the time the general gave his own blanket to a dying boy. They realized that their suffering hadn't been a tragedy. It had been an investment. They had paid for American freedom in blood and frostbite. December 14th, 1999, the final winter. On a freezing, snowy night at Mount Vernon, George Washington lay on his deathbed. He had been out riding in the snow and sleet, inspecting his farms, just as he had inspected the huts at Valley Forge 22 years earlier. He developed a severe throat infection. As his breath became labored and his strength faded, he did not cry out. He checked his own pulse, composed his limbs, and whispered his final words, "'Tis well." He died as he lived, with iron control and a refusal to surrender to fear. When the news reached Europe, the British Navy, the very fleet he had fought, lowered their flags to half-mast in respect. Napoleon Bonaparte ordered 10 days of mourning in France. Even his enemies knew that a giant had left the earth. The monument in the heart. Today, if you visit Valley Forge, you won't find a battlefield. There are no bullet-scarred walls or cannon-pitted hills. Instead, you find a quiet park with reconstructed log huts. It is a place of silence. But that silence is deceptive. Beneath that soil lies the DNA of a superpower. Every time an American faces an impossible situation and refuses to quit, the spirit of Valley Forge is alive. George Washington was not a perfect man. He was a man of his time, with all the flaws and complexities that come with it. But in that one winter, he became the indispensable man. He proved that leadership isn't about giving orders from a throne. It's about standing in the snow until the sun comes up.
Of Washington's refusal to surrender, we must look at the moment the war ended, because that is when the true winter of the soul began. It is easy to be a hero in the heat of battle. It is nearly impossible to be a hero when the fighting stops and the hunger for power begins. The Newburgh Conspiracy, the knife in the back. In March 1783, the army was camped at Newburgh, New York. The British were defeated, but the peace treaty wasn't signed yet. The soldiers were restless, angry, and broke. They had spent years in the cold, watched their friends die at Valley Forge, and now the Continental Congress was refusing to pay their promised pensions. A group of officers, encouraged by Washington's political rivals, began to circulate an anonymous letter. It was a call to arms, not against the British, but against the American government. They wanted to march on Philadelphia, seize power at the point of a bayonet, and crown Washington as their king. Washington was horrified. He had spent 7 years fighting to destroy a monarchy. He was not about to become the very thing he hated. But he knew his men were at a breaking point. If he didn't handle this perfectly, the American experiment would end in a military dictatorship before it even truly began. The moment the world gasped. Washington called a meeting of his officers in a large wooden building called the Temple. The air was thick with tension. Men who had bled with him at Monmouth and starved with him at Valley Forge looked at him with cold, defiant eyes. They felt betrayed by the country they had created. Washington stood before them and gave a speech, but it wasn't working. He could feel their hearts hardening against him. He then took out a letter from a congressman to read to them. He stared at the page, but the words wouldn't come. He fumbled in his pocket and pulled out something the men had never seen him wear in public: spectacles. He paused, his hands shaking slightly, and said with a voice full of heavy sorrow, "Gentlemen, you will permit me to put on my spectacles, for I have not only grown gray, but almost blind in the service of my country." That was it. That single human moment broke the conspiracy. The officers began to weep. They realized that their general had sacrificed more than any of them. He wasn't their king. He was their brother in arms. The winter was finally, truly over. The greatest act in human history. In December 1783, Washington walked into the Maryland State House where Congress was meeting. In a world ruled by emperors, czars, and sultans, men who killed to keep power, Washington did the unthinkable. He took his commission, the document that gave him command of the most powerful force in the Americas, and he handed it back. He resigned. He walked out of the room as a private citizen. When King George III of England heard that Washington was going back to his farm instead of taking the throne, he was stunned. He told his court, if he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world. And for once, the king was right. The legacy of the Barefoot Army. We often think of Valley Forge as a place of suffering, but it was actually the birthplace of the American character. It taught a nation that strength doesn't come from a crown or a bank account. It comes from the ability to endure.
The men who survived that winter went on to build the towns, the laws, and the families of the new United States. They were the old guard, and for decades after, if a man could say, "I was with the general at the forge," he never had to pay for a drink in any tavern in the land. They were a brotherhood forged in ice. The Eternal Watch. Washington eventually returned to Mount Vernon, but he was never truly retired. He was called back to lead the Constitutional Convention and eventually to serve as the first president, but those who knew him said he was never the same after the war. He carried the weight of the 2,500 men who didn't make it out of Valley Forge. Every December, when the snow falls over the hills of Pennsylvania, it covers the ground where the Revolution almost died. But beneath that snow is a reminder. America wasn't born in a moment of easy victory. It was born in a moment of cold, dark, agonizing struggle, where one man and the men who loved him simply refused to give up. George Washington's greatest victory wasn't at Yorktown. It was at Valley Forge, where he defeated the urge to surrender. Because he didn't quit, we are here today. While the war was won on the battlefield, the hardest part of Washington's journey began in the silence of the aftermath. To truly understand why he would not surrender at Valley Forge, we have to look at the winter of the presidency, a time when the man who had defeated the British Empire had to defeat the chaos of a brand new nation. The Reluctant King. In 1789, the Electoral College did something that has never happened since. They voted unanimously. Every single vote was for George Washington. He didn't want the job. He wrote to a friend that his journey to the inauguration felt like a culprit going to the place of his execution. Why? Because at Valley Forge he had seen what happens when government fails. He had seen his men rot because of a weak Congress. Now, as the first president, the ghost of that winter sat on his shoulder. He knew that if he failed, the blood spilled in the snow of Pennsylvania would have been for nothing. The Battle of the Cabinet. Washington's presidency was a political Valley Forge. Inside his own cabinet, a civil war was brewing. Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton, two brilliant men who had both served Washington, now hated each other's visions for America. Hamilton, the veteran of the Yorktown trenches, wanted a strong industrial nation with a national bank. Jefferson, the philosopher, wanted a nation of farmers and feared that Washington was becoming a new King George. Washington sat between them, a giant made of stone. He was the only thing holding the country together. Just as he had kept the barefoot Liberty Boys from mutinying, now he kept the American government from tearing itself apart. He was the great moderator, the man who stayed in the room when everyone else wanted to walk out. The Final Temptation. As his second term came to an end in 1966, the world expected him to stay for life. Most leaders in human history, Julius Caesar, Cromwell, Napoleon, took power and never let go. The American people would have elected him until the day he died. But Washington remembered the lesson of the frozen valley. He remembered that the revolution wasn't about him, it was about us. In his farewell address, he did something revolutionary. He stepped down. He warned the nation about the dangers of political parties and entangling alliances with Europe. He was essentially giving the American people their marching orders for the next 200 years. He was telling them, "I have brought you through the winter. Now you must learn to walk on your own." The Death of the Titan. Washington eventually returned to Mount Vernon, but he was never truly retired. He was called back to lead the Constitutional Convention and eventually to serve as the first president, but those who knew him said he was never the same after the war. He carried the weight of the 2,500 men who didn't make it out of Valley Forge. Every December, when the snow falls over the hills of Pennsylvania, it covers the ground where the Revolution almost died. But beneath that snow is a reminder: America wasn't born in a moment of easy victory. It was born in a moment of cold, dark, agonizing struggle, where one man and the men who loved him simply refused to give up. George Washington's greatest victory wasn't at Yorktown. It was at Valley Forge, where he defeated the urge to surrender. Because he didn't quit, we are here today.
That George Washington would not surrender, we must look at the hidden faces in the shadows of the log huts. For a long time, history books only talked about the generals. But for a modern U.S. audience, the true grit of Valley Forge is found in the people who had no rank, yet held the line when the men were ready to break. The arrival of Lady Washington. In the darkest part of February, when the morale was at its lowest point, a carriage rattled into camp. Out stepped Martha Washington. She didn't come to live in a palace. She came to live in a cramped, drafty house in the middle of a graveyard. Her presence changed everything. She organized a society of women, wives of officers and local women, who moved through the camp like angels of mercy. They didn't just bring medicine, they brought a sense of home. They spent their days darning thousands of socks, sewing shirts, and visiting the pest houses where men lay dying of smallpox. When a soldier saw the general's wife knitting him a pair of socks or sitting by a dying man's bed, he realized he wasn't just a number in a ledger. He was part of a family. Martha was Washington's secret weapon. She kept the general's heart from turning to stone, and she kept the men's spirits from fading into the gray mist. The soldiers of color. There is another group often left out of the paintings, the hundreds of black and indigenous soldiers who stood in the snow at Valley Forge. In the 1st Rhode Island Regiment and other units, free black men and formerly enslaved men fought side by side with white farmers. They faced a double winter. They fought for a country that had not yet promised them their own freedom, yet they were some of the bravest men in the line. They stayed when others deserted. They bled into the same white snow as Washington himself. At Valley Forge, the Continental Army was the most integrated the American military would be until the Korean War, nearly 170 years later. Their presence was a silent, powerful demand that the words "all men are created equal" must eventually become true. The Great Sickness. We cannot talk about the surrender Washington refused without talking about the inoculation. This was perhaps Washington's most dangerous gamble. Smallpox was ravaging the camp. It was a more terrifying enemy than the British. Washington made a radical, controversial decision. He ordered the entire army to be inoculated, a primitive and dangerous form of vaccination. He had doctors cut the skin of healthy soldiers and rub in the pus from smallpox sores. It made the men sick, and for a few weeks the entire army was paralyzed. If the British had attacked during those weeks, the revolution would have ended in an afternoon. Washington stayed awake for nights on end, watching the perimeter, praying that the secret would hold. It did. The army emerged from the sickness immune. He had defeated a biological enemy that had destroyed empires. The final vision. As the spring of 1778 finally turned the hills green, Washington stood on the parade ground. He looked at his army. They were scarred, they were thin, and many were missing fingers or toes to the frost, but they stood straight. A legend says that during the winter, Washington had a vision of the future of America, a vision of a great nation stretching from sea to sea, a beacon of light for the world. Whether the vision was real or not, Washington acted as if it were. He saw what his men could not yet see. Conclusion.
the man who made a nation. When you look at the face of George Washington on the dollar bill or carved into the granite of Mount Rushmore, don't see a statue. See the man who stood in the freezing rain in December 1777, watching his friends die, hearing the whispers of traitors, and feeling the cold in his very marrow. He had every excuse to walk away. He could have gone home to his beautiful estate and let the colonies fall, but he didn't. He chose the mud. He chose the hunger. He chose the struggle. The United States of America was not won by a lucky shot or a brilliant speech. It was won because one man had a will of iron that was colder and harder than the Pennsylvania winter. George Washington would not surrender, and because he stayed, the world changed forever. While the flags were raised and the ceremonies of victory were held, the story of the winter Washington would not surrender has a final, haunting layer. It is the story of the debt of honor. For a video aimed at a U.S. audience, this is the emotional gut punch that makes the history feel real. The empty chairs. When the Army finally broke camp in June 1778, they left behind a city of the dead. Nearly 2,000 men were buried in the soil of Valley Forge. As the columns marched out, many soldiers looked back one last time at the rows of unmarked mounds. They were leaving their brothers behind in the mud. Washington, usually a man of steel, was seen pausing at the edge of the camp. He knew that for every soldier marching out to fight the British, there was a family back home in Massachusetts, in Virginia, in Connecticut, that would never receive a letter, never see a son return, and never know exactly where their loved one was buried. He carried those 2,000 ghosts with him for the rest of his life. The broken promise. The most tragic part of the Valley Forge story happened after the war. The soldiers had been promised pay, land, and a future, but the new American government was bankrupt. Many veterans of that winter walked home in the same rags they had worn in the snow. They were forced to sell their veteran certificates to wealthy speculators for pennies just to buy a meal. Years later, when Washington was president, he would often see these men. They would stand along the roads as his carriage passed, now old, limping, and poor. They would pull themselves up to a stiff military salute. They didn't ask for money. They just wanted the general to recognize them. And Washington always returned the salute. He never forgot that his greatness was built on their suffering. The spirit in the stone. There is a reason why Valley Forge is considered holy ground in American history. It isn't a place of a great victory like Yorktown or a famous charge like Gettysburg. It is a place of quiet defiance. It represents the American belief that even when you are at your absolute lowest, when you have no food, no shoes, and your own friends are plotting against you, you don't quit. You dig in, you train, you wait for the sun to rise. The final frame. The white horse in the mist. If you go to Valley Forge today on a cold, foggy morning in December, the wind still whistles through the gaps in the reconstructed log huts. If you close your eyes, you can almost hear the rhythmic tump-thump of von Steuben's drills and the crackle of the small fires that gave no heat. The story of George Washington at Valley Forge is the story of the human will. It tells us that a leader's job isn't to be perfect, but to be present. Washington stayed. He suffered. He endured. And in doing so, he gave a group of desperate rebels a reason to believe they were a nation.
The war was won and the presidency was finished, but there is a final, darker chapter to Washington's refusal to surrender, a battle that took place within the walls of his own mind and the halls of his home at Mount Vernon. This is the chapter where Washington had to decide what kind of legacy he would truly leave for the future of the American people. The weight of the great unfinished task. When Washington retired in 1797, he returned to a Mount Vernon that was falling apart. His fields were exhausted, and he was land-rich but cash-poor. But more than the money, he was haunted by the contradiction that sat at the heart of the new republic: slavery. Throughout the winter at Valley Forge, Washington had watched black soldiers die for a liberty they did not possess. He had seen the bravery of the 1st Rhode Island Regiment. He knew that if the United States was to survive its future winters, it could not remain a house divided. Yet he was a Virginian, trapped in a system that owned human beings. For the last 2 years of his life, Washington fought a silent, private war. He was receiving letters from his old friend, the Marquis de Lafayette, pleading with him to set an example and free his slaves. Washington knew that if he did this while he was president, the South would secede and the country would shatter. He had refused to surrender to the British, and now he refused to let the country fall into a premature civil war. The final winter, December 1799. On December 12, 1799, the sky over Virginia turned a bruised, heavy gray. A brutal storm of snow, hail, and sleet began to lash the Potomac. Washington, now 67 years old, spent 5 hours on his horse, riding through the freezing slush to inspect his farms. He was a man of habit, a man of the forge. He never let the weather stop his duty. He returned to the house soaked to the bone, snow hanging from his hair. He sat down to dinner without changing his clothes. By the next morning, his throat was closing. He could barely speak. This was the winter of the body. The doctors of the time, using the primitive and brutal medicine he had seen at Valley Forge, bled him. They took nearly 40% of his blood in a single day. They blistered his throat with toxic chemicals. They were essentially killing him in an attempt to save him. The refusal to fear. As he lay in his bed, struggling for every breath, Washington did not panic. He looked at his loyal servant, Christopher Shields, who had been standing by his side for hours. Washington told him to sit down and rest. Even in his final moments, he was the commander, looking out for his troops. He called for his 2 wills. In his final act of defiance against the customs of his time, he wrote a clause that no other founding father from the South dared to write. He ordered that his slaves be freed upon the death of his wife. He knew it wasn't enough to fix the nation's great sin, but it was his final signature, his way of saying that the spirit of Valley Forge belonged to everyone who bled for it. The ghostly farewell. At 10 p.m. on December 14th, Washington felt his own pulse. He knew the end had arrived. He looked at his doctor and said, "I am just going. Have me decently buried, and do not let my body be put into the vault in less than 3 days after I am dead." He wanted to make sure he wasn't buried alive, a final, lingering fear of a man who had survived so much. He died in the cold of December, just as he had lived through the cold of 1777. The eternal flame. Why does this story never end for Americans? Because George Washington represents the idea that character is destiny. He wasn't the smartest man in the room, that was Jefferson. He wasn't the most brilliant orator, that was Adams. But he was the man who stayed. He was the man who stood in the freezing mud of Valley Forge when everyone else wanted to go home. He was the man who turned down a crown because he believed in a country. In the final scene of this story, we see a vision of a modern American winter. When the wind howls through the skyscrapers of New York or over the plains of the Midwest, there is a piece of Washington in every person who persists. The story of Valley Forge isn't about a camp in Pennsylvania. It's about a place inside the human heart that refuses to say, "I quit." George Washington didn't just win a war.
He invented the American will. And that will is a fire that no winter, no matter how long or how cold, can ever put out.
Sea was a memory, but as George Washington lay in the frozen earth of Mount Vernon, a new struggle began. The battle for the memory of what happened in that valley. For a U.S. audience, this final chapter explains why, 250 years later, we still cannot look away from the man who stood in the snow. The world without him. When the news of Washington's death reached the world in 1799, it wasn't just Americans who mourned. In England, the British Royal Navy, the same men who had tried to kill him, lowered their flags to half-mast. In France, Napoleon Bonaparte ordered 10 days of official mourning. The world was in shock because they had never seen a man like him. He was a man who could have been a king, but chose to be a citizen. He was a man who could have had absolute power, but chose to follow the law. This was the ultimate victory of Valley Forge. The discipline he learned in the cold had become the discipline of a nation. The secret of the iron will. People often ask, what was Washington thinking during those midnight walks in the snow? He wasn't thinking about maps or bayonets. He was thinking about legacy. He knew that if he surrendered, the world would say that democracy was impossible. They would say that common people could never rule themselves, that they would always need a king to tell them what to do. By refusing to surrender, Washington wasn't just saving his own skin. He was proving that we, the people, could endure anything. He was the anchor that kept the ship of state from drifting into the rocks of anarchy. The living monument. Today, the monument to George Washington isn't just the giant white obelisk in Washington, D.C. It is every veteran who stands a watch. It is every teacher who tells the story of liberty. It is every citizen who votes. If you go to Valley Forge today, the grass is green and the air is sweet. You can see the National Memorial Arch. On it, there is an inscription that captures the entire 14-chapter journey we have taken. Naked and starving as they are, we cannot enough admire the incomparable patience and fidelity of the soldiery. Those were Washington's own words. He didn't take the credit for himself. He gave it to the men who bled. He was the leader who made them believe they were giants. The final frame, the American fire. The story of the winter Washington would not surrender is a story that never truly ends. It is a cycle. Every generation has its own winter. Every generation faces its own British Empire or its own starving time. But the message from the 1777 snow is clear. The winter is only as cold as your spirit. The night is only as dark as your fear. If you do not surrender, the spring will come. The fire that started in a small log hut in Pennsylvania didn't just warm a few shivering soldiers. It lit a flame that spread across the globe, toppling kings and inspiring millions, and that fire still burns. George Washington didn't just survive the winter, he conquered it. And because he did, the United States of America, the greatest experiment in human history, was allowed to live. To finish this story, we must look at the hidden reality of the American soul that was forged in that ice. For a U.S. audience, this isn't just a history lesson, it is a mirror. It is the story of how a collection of strangers from different worlds became a single, unbreakable unit. The melting pot of the frozen valley. Before Valley Forge, there was no American. There were Virginians, New Yorkers, and Pennsylvanians. They hated each other. They fought for food. They spoke different dialects. They distrusted each other's religions. In the beginning of the winter, the camp was a powder keg of internal prejudice. But the cold is a great equalizer. The snow doesn't care if you are a wealthy planter from the South or a poor fisherman from Marblehead. Washington watched as the shared suffering began to dissolve the borders between the colonies. When a soldier from New Jersey shared his last bit of fire cake with a man from Georgia, the
the United States was truly born. Washington leaned into this. He stopped referring to his troops by their state names. He called them the American Continental Army. He was crafting a new identity out of the frostbite. He was teaching them that they weren't fighting for their local soil. They were fighting for an idea. The general's secret tears.
Your U.S. audience, we must look at the afterlife of the struggle. This isn't just about what happened in 1777. It's about how that frozen ground became the foundation for every American generation that followed. This is the story of the silent witness, the earth of Valley Forge. If you were to take a handful of soil from the hills of Valley Forge today, you aren't just holding dirt, you are holding the physical remains of the men who didn't survive. Their bodies became the grass. Their breath became the wind that still rattles the shutters of Washington's headquarters. For years after the war, local farmers would plow the fields and find rusted bayonets, lead musket balls, and the buttons from Continental uniforms. Each object was a silent scream from the past, a reminder that the price of liberty isn't a metaphor. It is paid in metal, bone, and frozen earth. The general's return. In 1787, while Washington was in Philadelphia presiding over the Constitutional Convention, he took a day off. He didn't go to a party or a tavern. He rode his horse back to Valley Forge. He stood alone on the hills where his army had nearly vanished. The huts were gone, and the trenches were filled with weeds. The silence was absolute. He stayed there for hours, looking at the landscape. He wasn't mourning, he was remembering. He was reminding himself why he was in Philadelphia, trying to write a constitution. He was telling himself, I am doing this for the men who stayed here. I am making sure their sacrifice wasn't a mistake. The eternal torch. There is a profound lesson in the winter George Washington would not surrender that hits home for a modern U.S. audience. The world doesn't belong to the strongest or the richest. It belongs to the most persistent. The British had the best navy, they had the most money, they had the professional training, but they didn't have the Valley Forge heart. They didn't have a reason to stay in the cold other than a paycheck. Washington's men had a reason. They were fighting for their own homes, their own children, and a future they were building with their own frost-bitten hands. The final frame, the torch passes. As the screen fades to black on your video, the audience shouldn't feel like they just watched a museum piece. They should feel like they were part of the line. Washington's story at Valley Forge is a challenge to every viewer. It asks, what is your Valley Forge? What is the challenge that makes you want to quit? And what is the iron will inside you that will make you stay? The American spirit isn't found in the gold of the Gilded Age or the skyscrapers of the modern era. It is found in the dark, in the cold, and in the mud, standing next to a man on a white horse who says, "Not today. We do not surrender today." The lasting echo. George Washington died in a winter storm, but he left behind a fire that has burned for 250 years. He proved that one man's refusal to give up can change the destiny of millions. He wasn't a god, he was a man who chose not to break. And as long as there is an America, there will be a Valley Forge. And as long as there is a Valley Forge, there will be the spirit of the general who looked at the abyss and chose to keep marching. The winter is over, the war is won, but the general is still watching. Final video production wrap-up. Final visual, a slow fade from a black and white sketch of Washington at prayer to a high-definition shot of the modern American flag flying over the National Memorial Arch. Final sound, the sound of a single sharp clack of a musket being cocked, followed by the sound of a distant cheering army.
final on-screen text: forged in the cold, built to last. The story of the winter he would not surrender does not end with a medal or a parade. It ends with a cold, hard realization that would resonate with any modern American patriot. The cost of keeping a nation is often higher than the cost of creating it. The Silent War of 1780. To understand the depth of Washington's iron will, we have to look past Valley Forge to the winter of 1780 at Morristown. If Valley Forge was a tragedy, Morristown was a nightmare. It was the coldest winter in recorded American history. The Hudson River froze solid enough for the British to drive heavy cannons across the ice. The men were starving again, but this time they were angry. Mutiny wasn't just a whisper in the huts, it was a fire in the ranks. The Pennsylvania and New Jersey lines actually picked up their muskets and marched on Congress. Washington stood in the middle of this storm. He knew that if he crushed the mutineers with violence, he would lose the heart of his army. If he let them go, he would lose the war. He had to be a judge, a father, and a general all at once. He managed to negotiate, to find food where there was none, and to remind his men that their suffering had a purpose. He told them, "The eyes of the world are upon you. If you break now, the dream of liberty dies forever." The betrayal of the heart. It was during these dark, frozen years that Washington faced his greatest personal wound, the treason of Benedict Arnold. Arnold was Washington's best fighting general, a man he loved like a son. When Arnold turned his coat for British gold, it shattered Washington. For the first time in the war, Washington was seen to break. He put his head in his hands and asked his aides, "Whom can we trust now?" But here is the lesson of Washington's life. He did not stay down. Within hours of discovering the treason, he was back in the saddle. He tightened the defenses of West Point. He hunted down the conspirators. He took the pain of betrayal and turned it into a shield. He refused to let one man's cowardice undo the sacrifice of the thousands who had died in the snow. The invisible enemy, the winter of the soul. As the war dragged into its 8th year, the American people were tired. The economy was a wreck. The British were waiting for the Americans to simply give up and go home. This was the winter of the soul. Washington became a symbol of total persistence. He stayed in the field. He refused to go home to his comfortable bed at Mount Vernon until the last British soldier left American soil. He became a living statue of the Revolution. Every time a soldier thought about deserting, he looked at the tall man in the blue coat who had been standing in the rain and snow since 1775, and he stayed. The final threshold. When the peace treaty was finally signed, Washington didn't celebrate by seizing power. He went to a small room in Annapolis and did the most American thing possible. He surrendered his sword to the law. He proved that in America, no man is above the law, and no winter is too cold for the fire of a free heart. The closing legend. There is a story that when Washington was an old man, someone asked him how he survived the dark days when everyone else was ready to quit. He looked out over the fields of his home and said, "I never let my eyes leave the horizon. I knew that the sun would rise, provided we were still standing when it did." George Washington was the man who stood standing. He was the anchor of the American soul. And because he stood his ground in the mud, the ice, and the blood, we have a ground to stand on today. Video production notes. Atmosphere. The lighting should shift from the dark blue-gray of the winter huts to a bright golden sunrise over the Potomac River. Narrator's voice. Lower the pitch, make it slower and more weighted with the burden of history. Key phrase to display. He held the line when the line was breaking.
Washington never surrendered. we must look at the final, invisible battleground. This wasn't a battle fought with muskets or bayonets, but a battle of the fortress of the mind. For a U.S. audience, this is the most profound lesson, that the greatest winter Washington faced wasn't in Pennsylvania. It was the winter of doubt that threatened to freeze the American heart. The Siege of Despair. By 1781, before the miracle at Yorktown, the American cause was effectively a corpse. The currency was worthless. The phrase, "not worth a continental," became a common insult. The French were losing patience. The British had captured Charleston and were ravaging the South. Inside the American camp, the Valley Forge spirit was being tested like never before. This was the moment where Washington's leadership reached its zenith. He realized that an army is not a collection of weapons, but a collection of beliefs. He began a relentless campaign of psychological warfare. He didn't just train his men's bodies, he fed their minds. He ensured that even when there was no meat, there was orderly book news of small victories. He created the Badge of Military Merit, the precursor to the Purple Heart, the first award in history given to common soldiers for singularly meritorious action. He was telling the world that a private was just as noble as a king. The midnight duel with General Clinton. While Washington sat in the cold, his rival, the British General Henry Clinton, sat in a luxury mansion in New York. Clinton was waiting for Washington to break. He sent spies, he sent bribes, and he sent proclamations of mercy if the Americans would just lay down their arms. Washington responded with a silence that was terrifying. He moved his troops in shadows. He created the Culper spy ring, the most sophisticated intelligence network of the era. While Clinton drank wine, Washington was reading Clinton's mail. He turned the winter into a cloak of invisibility. He proved that a man who refuses to surrender cannot be predicted, and a man who cannot be predicted cannot be defeated. The weight of the unseen. As the war finally tilted toward the Americans, Washington faced one last winter. His own health was failing. He suffered from constant dental pain, rheumatism from sleeping on the wet ground, and the exhaustion of being the indispensable man for 8 straight years. He could have stepped aside. He could have let a younger man lead the final charge, but he stayed. He knew that the revolution was a bridge, and he was the keystone. If he moved, the whole arch would collapse into the river of history. The final surrender of the self. When the war finally ended and Washington stood on the deck of a barge leaving New York, he did something that no conqueror in the history of the world had ever done. He didn't look at the land he had won as a prize. He looked at it as a steward. He had spent the winter of 1777 refusing to surrender his army to the British. He spent the winter of 1783 refusing to surrender his honor to the temptation of power. The eternal flame. Washington's story at Valley Forge is the story of the modern American. It tells us that we are a people born of hardship. We are not a nation of easy victories. We are a nation of hard-won endurances. When you see the snow fall today, remember that it once fell on a man who had no reason to hope, yet chose to stand. It fell on an army that was naked and starving, yet chose to march. George Washington did not just survive the winter, he owned the winter. He took the cold and turned it into a weapon. He took the hunger and turned it into a hunger for justice. And because he would not surrender, the sun that rose over Yorktown still shines on us today. The struggle was the teacher. The cold was the forge. The man was the miracle. Final visual montage, a rapid-fire sequence of the grave at Valley Forge, the resignation in Annapolis, and the inauguration in New York, finally resting on a close-up of the words, "We the People." Final audio,
the sound of a cold wind that slowly morphs into the sound of a cheering crowd, then a single, final gavel strike. Call to action: if you found strength in the general story, share this to remind others that no winter lasts forever. While the world remembers the battles and the speeches, there is a final darker layer to the winter Washington would not surrender. It is the story of the general's final shadow, the period after the war when Washington realized that the hardest part of the revolution wasn't winning it, but making sure it was worth the blood spilled in the snow. The haunting of Mount Vernon. When Washington finally returned to his home in December 1783, he was a man transformed. He was no longer just a Virginia planter, he was the living symbol of a new world. But as he sat in his study, the ghosts of Valley Forge were never far away. He kept his wartime maps spread out on his desk. He corresponded with the mothers of soldiers who had never come home. He realized that his refusal to surrender had placed a permanent debt on his shoulders. He felt he owed it to the 2,000 men buried in the Pennsylvania mud to ensure that the government they died for didn't collapse into chaos. This is what drove him back into public life to lead the Constitutional Convention. He wasn't looking for more power. He was fulfilling a promise made in a frozen hut years before. The Midnight Sentinel. Even as president, Washington's leadership style remained rooted in the winter of 1777. He was a man of immense self-control. When his political enemies attacked his character, when the press called him a traitor for trying to keep the U.S. out of a war with France, he did not lash out. He applied the iron discipline he had used at Valley Forge. He knew that the president wasn't a king who could silence his critics. He was a servant who had to endure the winter of public opinion. He taught the American people that the true strength of a democracy isn't in its loud voices, but in its quiet, steady endurance. The closing frame, the legacy of the unbroken. The winter George Washington would not surrender is the ultimate American epic. It is the story of a man who looked at a hopeless situation and decided that hope was something you built with your own hands, not something you waited for. As your video concludes, the audience should see a vision of the modern world. They should see the lights of a free city, the faces of children in school, and the quiet dignity of a peaceful transition of power. All of these things are the spring that followed Washington's winter. He was the man who held the shield when there was no one else to hold it. He was the man who stayed in the cold so that we could live in the light. The winter was his forge, the army was his steel, the nation is his monument. Final video direction, ending segment. Visual, a slow, dramatic dissolve from the cold, blue hues of a Valley Forge sunset to the warm, golden light hitting the face of the Lincoln Memorial or the Washington Monument. Audio, a deep, resonant bass note that lingers as the screen fades to black. Final call to action: history isn't just about what happened, it's about what we choose to remember. If you believe the general story should never be forgotten, like and subscribe for more untold American history.
Story of victory, the true story of the winter Washington would not surrender, has a final, more intimate chapter. This is the story of the personal toll, the physical and emotional price one man paid to ensure a nation could breathe its first breath. For a U.S. audience, this is the human chapter, showing that Washington wasn't a marble statue, but a man who gave every ounce of his life to a cause that often felt like it was failing. The physical scars of command. When Washington rode away from the ruins of Valley Forge in 1778, he was a different man than the one who had arrived. The stress of that winter had etched deep lines into his face that would never leave. His hair, once a vibrant reddish brown, had turned prematurely white. He suffered from chronic camp fever and a back that was permanently stooped from sleeping on frozen ground. Most people don't know that Washington's famous dental problems were made significantly worse at Valley Forge. Malnutrition and the lack of vitamin C caused his teeth to loosen and decay. He spent many nights in his headquarters holding his face in pain, yet he never let his soldiers see a moment of weakness. He knew that if the general looked defeated, the army would follow. He wore a mask of iron to hide a body that was breaking. The emotional winter. The winter wasn't just about snow, it was about the crushing loneliness of command. Washington was surrounded by thousands of men, yet he was utterly alone. He couldn't share his fears with his soldiers, and he couldn't trust many of his officers who were busy writing letters to Congress to have him replaced. Imagine him in the Isaac Potts house, staring at a map by a single candle. Every death in the camp was a weight on his soul. Every report of a soldier deserting was a knife in his heart. He once wrote to a friend, "I feel like a man who was being asked to save a drowning person while his own hands are tied behind his back." He wasn't a god. He was a man who stayed awake so his country could sleep. The final guard mount at Mount Vernon. After he resigned his commission in 1783, Washington returned to Mount Vernon, hoping for peace. But he found that the winter followed him. He was haunted by the faces of the men who had died in the snow. He kept a list of the widows and orphans of his fallen soldiers and spent a significant portion of his own money trying to help them. He didn't just win the war, he felt responsible for the lives it cost. This is why he was so obsessed with building a stable government. He believed that if America fell into chaos or civil war, the 2,500 lives lost at Valley Forge would have been murdered by his own ambition. Every policy he signed as president was a way of saying to those dead soldiers, "Your sacrifice mattered." The eternal sentinel. As the sun sets on our story, we see Washington one last time. It is December 1999. He is dying. The room is cold and the snow is falling outside, just as it did at Valley Forge. He doesn't ask for a monument. He doesn't ask for a parade. He asks for his watch. He checks his pulse. He is a man of order to the very end. He died as he had lived, facing the winter with his eyes open and his spirit unbroken. The closing frame. The unbroken line. The story of George Washington at Valley Forge is the story of the American spirit. It tells us that our nation wasn't founded on easy success, but on difficult endurance. It tells us that a leader's true greatness isn't measured by how many battles they win, but by how many winters they can survive without losing their soul. As your video ends, let the audience see the faces of modern Americans, people working in the rain, soldiers on guard, students studying late into the night. These are the descendants of the Valley Forge heart. Washington didn't just survive a winter, he created a legacy of persistence that defines what it means to be an American. He proved that no matter how deep the snow or how dark the night, the man who refuses to surrender is the man who changes the world. He held the line in the snow so we could march in the sun. Video production wrap-up. The finale. Final visual. A slow-motion shot of the Washington Monument reflecting in the pool at sunrise, transitioning to a grainy black and white silhouette of a man on a horse in the fog. Final audio. The sound of a heavy door closing, followed by the sound of a distant soaring eagle. Final text overlay. The winter ended, the nation began. The winter at Valley Forge was a military encampment, yes, but it was also a laboratory. It was here that Washington stopped being just a general and began to think like a founder. For your audience, this chapter reveals the high-stakes intellectual battle that took place while the men were freezing, the battle to design a military that would never become a tyranny. The civil commander. At Valley Forge,
Washington was under immense pressure to seize food and supplies from the local Pennsylvania farmers by force. His men were literally starving to death. Most generals in history would have declared martial law, taken what they needed at gunpoint, and dealt with the consequences later. But Washington refused. He insisted on paying the farmers in continental scrip, even though it was nearly worthless. He wrote to Congress, "If I violate the rights of the people to save the army, I have destroyed the very thing I am fighting for." This was a revolutionary concept. He was teaching his soldiers that they were servants of the people, not their masters. He was building the civilian control of the military, a cornerstone of American democracy, right there in the frozen mud. The forge of diversity. Valley Forge was the first time the different tribes of America truly collided. You had the rough frontiersmen from the West, the polished merchants from New England, and the aristocratic planters from the South. They didn't just like each other, they were on the verge of internal war. Washington used the winter to break these provincial identities. He integrated the units. He made a man from Virginia sleep in the same hut as a man from Massachusetts. He created a common army culture that transcended state lines. He realized that if they could survive a winter together, they could build a country together. He was the first to realize that e pluribus unum, or out of many, one, wasn't just a motto, it was a survival strategy. The intelligence war, the Culper Ghost. While the men trained with von Steuben, Washington was running one of the most sophisticated spy rings in history. He spent his nights at Valley Forge decoding secret messages written in invisible ink. He had agents inside British-occupied Philadelphia, men and women like Robert Townsend and Lydia Dara, who risked their lives to send him information in scraps of paper hidden in buttons or woven into laundry. He used the winter as a cover. The British thought Washington was paralyzed by the cold. In reality, he was more active than ever, mapping every British move, every supply ship, and every weakness. He proved that information was as vital as gunpowder. He was the first American leader to master the art of the shadow war. The final guard mount.
Your U.S. audience, we must look at the afterlife of the struggle. This isn't just about what happened in 1777. It's about how that frozen ground became the foundation for every American generation that followed. This is the story of the silent witness, the earth of Valley Forge. If you were to take a handful of soil from the hills of Valley Forge today, you aren't just holding dirt, you are holding the physical remains of the men who didn't survive. Their bodies became the grass, their breath became the wind that still rattles the shutters of Washington's headquarters. For years after the war, local farmers would plow the fields and find rusted bayonets, lead musket balls, and the buttons from Continental uniforms. Each object was a silent scream from the past, a reminder that the price of liberty isn't a metaphor. It is paid in metal, bone, and frozen earth. The generals return. In 1787, while Washington was in Philadelphia presiding over the Constitutional Convention, he took a day off. He didn't go to a party or a tavern. He rode his horse back to Valley Forge. He stood alone on the hills where his army had nearly vanished. The huts were gone, and the trenches were filled with weeds. The silence was absolute. He stayed there for hours, looking at the landscape. He wasn't mourning, he was remembering. He was reminding himself why he was in Philadelphia, trying to write a constitution. He was telling himself, I am doing this for the men who stayed here. I am making sure their sacrifice wasn't a mistake. The eternal torch. There is a profound lesson in the winter George Washington would not surrender that hits home for a modern U.S. audience. The world doesn't belong to the strongest or the richest. It belongs to the most persistent. The British had the best navy. They had the most money. They had the professional training.
But they didn't have the Valley Forge heart. They didn't have a reason to stay in the cold other than a paycheck. Washington's men had a reason. They were fighting for their own homes, their own children, and a future they were building with their own frost-bitten hands. The final frame, the torch passes. As the screen fades to black on your video, the audience shouldn't feel like they just watched a museum piece. They should feel like they were part of the line. Washington's story at Valley Forge is a challenge to every viewer. It asks, what is your Valley Forge? What is the challenge that makes you want to quit? And what is the iron will inside you that will make you stay? The American spirit isn't found in the gold of the Gilded Age or the skyscrapers of the modern era. It is found in the dark, in the cold, and in the mud, standing next to a man on a white horse who says, "Not today. We do not surrender today." The lasting echo. George Washington died in a winter storm, but he left behind a fire that has burned for 250 years. He proved that one man's refusal to give up can change the destiny of millions. He wasn't a god, he was a man who chose not to break. And as long as there is an America, there will be a Valley Forge. And as long as there is a Valley Forge, there will be the spirit of the general who looked at the abyss and chose to keep marching. The winter is over, the war is won, but the general is still watching. Final video production wrap-up. Final visual, a slow fade from a black and white sketch of Washington at prayer to a high-definition shot of the modern American flag flying over the National Memorial Arch. Final sound, the sound of a single sharp clack of a musket being cocked, followed by the sound of a distant cheering army. Final on-screen text, forged in the cold, built to last. The story of the winter he would not surrender does not end with a medal or a parade. It ends with a cold, hard realization that would resonate with any modern American patriot. The cost of keeping a nation is often higher than the cost of creating it. The Silent War of 1780. To understand the depth of Washington's iron will, we have to look past Valley Forge to the winter of 1780 at Morristown. If Valley Forge was a tragedy, Morristown was a nightmare. It was the coldest winter in recorded American history. The Hudson River froze solid enough for the British to drive heavy cannons across the ice. The men were starving again, but this time they were angry. Mutiny wasn't just a whisper in the huts, it was a fire in the ranks. The Pennsylvania and New Jersey lines actually picked up their muskets and marched on Congress. Washington stood in the middle of this storm. He knew that if he crushed the mutineers with violence, he would lose the heart of his army. If he let them go, he would lose the war. He had to be a judge, a father, and a general all at once. He managed to negotiate, to find food where there was none, and to remind his men that their suffering had a purpose. He told them, "The eyes of the world are upon you. If you break now, the dream of liberty dies forever." The betrayal of the heart. It was during these dark, frozen years that Washington faced his greatest personal wound, the treason of Benedict Arnold. Arnold was Washington's best fighting general, a man he loved like a son. When Arnold turned his coat for British gold, it shattered Washington. For the first time in the war, Washington was seen to break. He put his head in his hands and asked his aides, "Whom can we trust now?" But here is the lesson of Washington's life. He did not stay down. Within hours of discovering the treason, he was back in the saddle. He tightened the defenses of West Point. He hunted down the conspirators. He took the pain of betrayal and turned it into a shield. He refused to let one man's cowardice undo the sacrifice of the thousands who had died in the snow. The invisible enemy, the winter of the soul. As the war dragged into its 8th year, the American people were tired. The economy was a wreck. The British were waiting for the Americans to simply give up and go home. This was the winter of the soul. Washington became a symbol of total persistence. He stayed in the field. He refused to go home to his comfortable bed at Mount Vernon until the last British soldier left American soil. He became a living statue of the Revolution. Every time a soldier thought about deserting, he looked at the tall man in the blue coat who had been standing in the rain and snow since 1775, and he stayed. The final threshold. When the peace treaty was finally signed, Washington didn't celebrate by seizing power. He went to a small room in Annapolis and did the most American thing possible. He surrendered his sword to the law. He proved that in America, no man is above the law, and no winter is too cold for the fire of a free heart. The closing legend. There is a story that when Washington was an old man, someone asked him how he survived the dark days when everyone else was ready to quit. He looked out over the fields of his home and said, "I never let my eyes leave the horizon. I knew that the sun would rise, provided we were still standing when it did." George Washington was the man who stood standing. He was the anchor of the American soul. And because he stood his ground in the mud, the ice, and the blood, we have a ground to stand on today. Video production notes. Atmosphere. The lighting should shift from the dark blue-gray of the winter huts to a bright golden sunrise over the Potomac River. Narrator's voice. Lower the pitch, make it slower and more weighted with the burden of history. Key phrase to display. He held the line when the line was breaking.
Saga, we must look at the after-action of Washington's soul. The war ended in 1783, but for George Washington, the internal war, the struggle to ensure that the Valley Forge heart lived on in the people, never truly ceased. This is the story of the general's final watch. The Midnight Visitation. In the winter of 1798, just a year before his death, George Washington was at Mount Vernon. A young visitor asked him what his most vivid memory of the war was. The visitor expected him to say the surrender at Yorktown or the daring crossing of the Delaware. Instead, Washington looked out at the freezing Potomac and spoke of the hospitals at Valley Forge. He described the smell of the damp straw and the sound of men whispering the names of their wives in their final breaths. He revealed that he had kept a private notebook of the names of the ordinary men who had done extraordinary things during that winter. To Washington, the general was merely a title, but the soldier was a sacred calling. He had refused to surrender at Valley Forge because he believed that the common man was worth more than the crown of any king. The living blueprint. Valley Forge wasn't just a place where an army survived. It was where the American idea was stress-tested. Think of it as a bridge being weighted with 10 times the load it was built to carry. If the bridge held, it could hold anything. By staying in the field, Washington proved 3 things that define the U.S. today. Unity over origin. A Virginian could bleed for a New Yorker. Order over anarchy. Even in starvation, the law must be followed. And the long game. Victory is not a single day. It is the sum of every day you refuse to quit. The final guard mount. In the final months of his life, Washington was often seen walking the perimeter of his estate in the snow. He was an old man, his body a map of the wars he had fought. But he never wore a heavy coat unless it was absolutely necessary. He wanted to feel the air. He wanted to remember the cold. He knew that comfort is the enemy of vigilance. He left behind a final warning for the nation, that the winter would return.
He knew that every generation would face its own test, its own moment where the supplies run low and the enemy seems too strong. His life was a message sent across the centuries. I stood in the snow so that you could stand in the sun. Do not let the fire go out. The closing frame, the eternal horizon. As your video ends, we don't see Washington as a statue in a park. We see him as he was on that night in February 1778, a man with cold hands, a heavy heart, and a mind that refused to break. The story of the winter George Washington would not surrender is not about the past, it is about the future. It is the story of every American who has ever been told it can't be done and replied, "Watch me." The footprints in the snow at Valley Forge have been covered by the seasons, but the path they made is still there. It is the path to freedom, and it is open to anyone with the courage to walk it. The general has finished his watch. The line is now yours. While the world remembers the thunder of cannons at Yorktown, the true victory of the American Revolution was a quiet internal one that happened in the months following the war. This is the chapter of the Silent Covenant, the moment Washington had to choose between being a legend and being a man of his word. The temptation of the Great Retreat. In 1783, after the fighting had stopped but before the peace treaty was signed, the Continental Army was still camped at Newburgh. The men were angry. They had survived Valley Forge, they had defeated the British, and yet Congress still hadn't paid them. They felt abandoned by the very people they had saved. A group of high-ranking officers approached Washington with a dangerous idea, the Newburgh Conspiracy. They wanted him to lead the army into Philadelphia, overthrow Congress, and take total control. They wanted him to be king. Washington looked at these men who had bled for him in the snow, and he felt their pain. But he also knew that if he took the crown, the winter of Valley Forge would have nothing. He had refused to surrender to the British, and now he had to refuse to surrender to his own men's resentment. The speech that saved a nation. On March 15, 1783, Washington walked into a meeting of his angry officers. He gave a speech that didn't work. The men remained cold and defiant. Then he took out a letter from a congressman. He fumbled with it, then reached into his pocket for a pair of spectacles. He had never worn them in public before. He whispered, "Gentlemen, you will permit me to put on my spectacles, for I have not only grown gray, but almost blind in the service of my country." In that one moment, the anger vanished. The officers realized that their general had given everything, his health, his eyesight, and his prime years, not for power, but for them. The conspiracy died right there. Washington had won the hardest battle of the war, the battle against his own army's resentment. The final guard mount. When Washington finally returned to Mount Vernon in Christmas Eve 1783, he thought he was done, but the winter had left a mark on his soul. He realized that the United States was like a newborn child in a blizzard. It needed a structure to survive. He spent the next few years writing thousands of letters, building a network of leaders who would eventually create the Constitution. He was the architect of the peace. He took the discipline he learned from von Steuben at Valley
and alliances. The winter he would not surrender has a deeper, more visceral layer that connects directly to the soul of every person who has ever felt forgotten. This is the chapter of the unspoken vow, the moment Washington realized he wasn't just leading an army, but a new kind of human family. The anatomy of the sacrifice. At Valley Forge, the barefoot soldier wasn't just a poetic image, it was a medical reality. By February 1778, nearly 4,000 men were listed as unfit for duty because they lacked shoes, coats, or blankets.
The trails between the log huts were literally stained red. Washington would walk these trails every morning. He didn't hide in his headquarters. He stepped in the same frozen blood. He saw the black frost taking the toes and fingers of his youngest recruits. In his private letters, his tone changed from a commander to a man who was witnessing a massacre of his own children. He wrote to Congress, "Unless some great and capital change takes place, this army must inevitably be reduced to one or other of these three things: starve, dissolve, or disperse." He knew that if he left, if he took a warm bed in a nearby town, the army would dissolve in an afternoon. His vow was silent. If they bleed, I watch. If they starve, I stay. The Midnight Prayer. One of the most enduring legends of Valley Forge is that of a local blacksmith, Isaac Potts, who supposedly found Washington alone in the woods, on his knees in the snow, praying. While historians debate the literal truth of the story, its symbolic truth is undeniable. Washington was a man who had reached the end of human resources. He had no more food, no more money, and no more political support. He was leaning on something invisible. For a U.S. audience, this is the core of the American grit, the belief that when you have nothing left, you find a strength that isn't your own. He was the anchor in the storm, a man who stood still while the world around him was spinning into chaos. The final guard mount, the secret honor. Years after the war, when Washington was president, he was asked why he didn't take a salary for his 8 years of service as general. He replied that his honor was the only payment he required. But the real reason was deeper. He felt that he could not take a single coin for a war that had cost his men their lives and their limbs. He carried a survivor's debt. Every time he looked at his own comfortable life at Mount Vernon, he saw the faces of the men at Valley Forge who never got to go home. This guilt, this sacred burden, is what made him the most humble, powerful man in history. The closing frame, the echo of the boots. As your video ends, the camera should pull back from a close-up of a single, bloody footprint in the white snow. As the camera rises higher and higher, the footprint turns into a road, the road turns into a city, and the city turns into the United States. The message is clear. Everything we have was built on top of those footprints. The winter of 1777 didn't break the American spirit, it tempered it. It turned a collection of rebels into a nation of brothers, and at the center of it all was the man who refused to move, the man who became a monument before he was even a memory. The snow has melted, the wounds have healed, but the vow is eternal. As we draw the final curtain on this epic, we must look at the afterlife of Valley Forge. The winter of 1777 to 1778 was not just a historical event, it became a permanent state of mind for George Washington. For the rest of his life, he was a man who lived as though the frost were just outside the door. This final chapter explores the legacy of the unbroken. The Midnight Watchman. Even after the war, in the quiet halls of Mount Vernon or the bustling streets of the new capital, Washington remained the sentinel. He was famous for his morning routine, rising before the sun, often in a cold room to begin his work. He never allowed himself to become soft. He knew that the British were no longer the primary threat. The new enemies were apathy and division. He watched with a heavy heart as the states began to argue over taxes and borders. To Washington, these squabbles were an insult to the men who had shared a single blanket at Valley Forge. He became the national glue. Whenever the country threatened to tear itself apart, people would look at the man who had stood in the snow and feel a sense of shame for their own pettiness. His presence alone forced the nation to grow up. The living monument. Washington refused to have a grand palace or throne. He insisted on being called Mr. President. This was his final act of defiance against the old world. He had seen his soldiers die for the right to be citizens, not subjects. By living a life of simplicity and service, he made sure that the winter had a meaning. He was a man who understood that leadership is a sacrifice, not a privilege. He gave his health, his wealth, and his peace of mind so that the experiment of liberty could survive its first fragile years. He was the anchor that held the ship steady while the storm of history raged around it. The final frame, the eternal spring. If you visit Valley Forge today, you will see a landscape that is peaceful and green. But if you walk the trails near the Schuylkill River on a quiet evening, you can still feel the weight of what happened there. You can see the National Memorial Arch, which stands as a gateway between the past and the future. The story of the winter George Washington would not surrender is the story of the American will. It is a reminder that we are a people born of hardship, tempered by fire, and led by a man who believed that duty was the highest calling of the human soul. The frost is gone, the war is won, but the general is still on guard. And the muskets, there is a secret battle Washington fought that was just as dangerous as the winter cold, the Battle of the Pen. For a video audience, this chapter reveals the general as a politician, showing how he used words as a shield when he had no swords left. The desperate ink. Inside the small, cramped rooms of the Isaac Putz house, the candles never went out. While the soldiers huddled in huts, Washington and his family of aides, men like Alexander Hamilton and John Lawrence, were engaged in a frantic, silent war. Washington was writing hundreds of letters. He was writing to the Continental Congress, to the governors of the states, and to private wealthy citizens. His letters from Valley Forge are masterpieces of aggressive honesty. He didn't sugarcoat the truth. He told Congress that his men were naked and starving. He told them that the army was on the verge of dissolving. He used his pen to shame the politicians who were sitting in warm rooms while his men died. He realized that if he couldn't win the war of logistics, the war of bullets was already lost. He was the first American leader to understand that public opinion is a weapon of war. The ghost of the Treasury. At one point during the winter, the Continental Treasury was literally empty. There was no money to buy flour, even if it could be found. Washington did something that was technically illegal. He began to pledge his own personal fortune as collateral. He told suppliers that if the government wouldn't pay, he would. He was essentially buying the revolution out of his own pocket. He knew that if he surrendered his wealth, he might lose Mount Vernon, but if he surrendered the army, he would lose his soul. This is the part of the winter he would not surrender that people rarely talk about, the fact that Washington was willing to go bankrupt to keep the fire of liberty burning. The trial of the Conway cabal. In the darkest part of January 1778, a group of generals and politicians, led by Thomas Conway and Horatio Gates, began a secret plot to have Washington fired. They whispered that he was incompetent because he hadn't won a major battle in months. Washington found out about the plot through a leaked letter. Instead of exploding in anger, he acted with a terrifying calm. He sent a short, cold note to Conway, letting him know that he knew everything. He forced the conspirators into the light. By refusing to play their game of shadows, he made them look like cowards in the eyes of the army. He didn't just survive the snow, he survived the winter of treachery. The final frame, the ink that became law. As we look at the documents Washington signed at Valley Forge, we see the beginning of the American government. Every order he gave, every plea for supplies, and every rebuke of the Congress was a lesson in how a free people should govern themselves. He was teaching the nation that accountability is the price of freedom. He was proving that even in a crisis, you do not abandon the rules, you lean into them. He fought with a sword in the field, but he saved the nation with a pen in the hut. Video production note, the detail segment. Visual, a high-definition macro shot of a quill pen scratching on parchment, the ink looking dark and wet, transitioning to the white, frozen landscape outside the window. Audio, the sound of wind howling outside, contrasted with the quiet, rhythmic scratching of the pen and the crackle of a dying fire. Final text overlay. He spoke truth to power when he had no power left. While the history of Valley Forge is often told as a story of men in blue coats, there is a longer, deeper chapter that a U.S. audience needs to hear. The story of the camp followers and the wives who became the backbone of Washington's resistance. If Washington was the head of the army, these women were its heart. The Lady of the Camp. In February 1778, a carriage struggled through the snow toward the Isaac Putz house. Inside was Martha Washington. She didn't come to Valley Forge to live in luxury. She came because her husband was reaching his breaking point. Martha turned the general's headquarters into a hub of domestic defiance. She organized the other officers' wives into a massive sewing circle. They patched thousands of uniforms, knit socks for the frostbitten, and, most importantly, visited the pest houses, the hospitals. While the men were dying of typhus and smallpox, Martha sat by their bedsides, reading to them and writing letters to their mothers. She provided the one thing the army had lost: dignity. The invisible army. Beyond the officers' wives were hundreds of common women, wives of privates, widows, and refugees. They were the original logistics corps. They did the laundry, they cooked the meager rations, and they nursed the wounded. Washington realized that without these women, the desertion rate would have doubled. They provided the social glue that held the huts together. In the coldest nights, it was the presence of a wife or a mother that gave a soldier a reason to wake up the next morning. Washington, a man of strict decorum, grew to have immense respect for these soldiers in petticoats. He saw that they were enduring the same hunger and the same cold, often while caring for children in the camp. The sacrifice of the hearth. This chapter of the winter shows a different side of Washington's refusal to surrender. He wasn't just refusing to give up his army, he was refusing to let the American family be destroyed. He knew that back home, across the 13 colonies, women were running the farms, defending their homes from British raiders, and keeping the economy alive while their men were away. The winter was happening everywhere. By staying at Valley Forge, Washington was honoring the sacrifice of every woman who had sent her husband or son into the storm. He knew that if he failed, their sacrifice would be a tragedy. If he won, it would be a founding. The final frame, the soft hand and the iron will. As the screen fades, imagine a shot of Martha Washington's hand holding George's as he stares out at the snow. It is a reminder that even the strongest man needs a foundation. The story of Valley Forge is not just a story of muskets, it is the story of home. It is the story of how a group of people, men, women, and children, decided that their future was worth more than their current comfort. They were the unseen architects of the Republic. The men held the line, but the women held the men. The winter did not break them because they did not face it alone. Video production note. Close-up shots of domestic items, a needle and thread, a wooden bowl, a tattered letter, contrasted with the harsh, gray exterior of the log huts. Audio, the sound of a woman humming a soft 18th century lullaby layered under the sound of the winter wind. Final text overlay. Liberty was woven in the dark.
They were in the corner of the universe. This chapter reveals that the winter he would not surrender was actually the center of a massive global chess game. For your audience, this is the world stage chapter, showing how Washington's stubbornness in the mud forced the hand of the greatest empires on Earth. The Silent Spectator, King Louis XVI. Across the Atlantic, in the gilded halls of Versailles, the French king and his ministers were watching Pennsylvania through a telescope of spies. They didn't care about liberty, they cared about revenge against the British. But they had a rule: France does not back a loser. If Washington had abandoned Valley Forge in January, the French would have pulled their support. They would have seen the Americans as a temporary rebellion rather than a rising nation. Every day Washington stayed in that hut, he was sending a message to Paris. He was proving that the American Revolution was a solid investment. By refusing to die, he made the French believe he could win. The midnight arrival of the alliance. In May 1778, the news broke. France had signed the Treaty of Alliance. When the messenger rode into Valley Forge, the camp transformed. This wasn't just about more muskets, it was about the arrival of the French Navy. Suddenly, the British in Philadelphia weren't the hunters anymore. They were the prey. They realized that if the French fleet arrived at the mouth of the Delaware River, they would be trapped. Washington's long winter had paid off. By holding his position, he had forced the British to evacuate Philadelphia. He didn't have to win a battle to reclaim the city. He just had to outlast the enemy's patience. The transformation of the conflict. Because of Valley Forge, the American Revolution stopped being a colonial skirmish and became a world war. Within months, Spain and the Netherlands joined the fight. The British had to move troops to protect their colonies in the Caribbean, India, and Africa. Washington had successfully turned a local fight for tax rights into a global struggle for the future of the planet. He did this not with a grand navy, but with a group of starving men who refused to go home. He proved that persistence is a force of nature that can move mountains and change the borders of empires. The final frame, the bridge between worlds. As the screen fades, show a vision of the French and American flags flying together. It is a reminder that no one wins alone. The winter of 1777 was the dark room where the alliance was developed. Washington was the chemist who held the elements together until they bonded. He showed that a leader's greatest job is sometimes